Why the death penalty should be brought back in Canada. The criminal justice system exists in order to maintain order, safety, and peace within our society. It should apply laws equally to all people, resolve conflicts fairly, and uphold people's fundamental rights. Without a formal justice system, society can fall into chaos. People who hold the most power would face no punishment, and disputes would instead be settled through force rather than reason. Canada's criminal justice system works to provide a balance among the punishment of criminals, the safety of the public, and fairness to all people involved. In Canada, the punishment for crimes is determined and should be proportionate to the severity of the crime. Punishments range from fines for minor criminal acts to imprisonment for major criminal offenses. The criminal justice system also acts to prevent further harm to the community. Depending on the severity of their crimes, offenders may be sentenced to rehabilitation programs or long-term incarceration. The justice system also aims to be fair to all those who are affected by its sentencing decisions. Whether the punishments are proportionate to the severity of the crimes committed, and whether it is fair to the victims of the crime, are all things that must be taken into consideration. Balancing these goals can be challenging because although a long imprisonment sentence may satisfy the public, if the issues are not addressed at the core, there may be long-term consequences when the offender is released. Capital punishment, otherwise known as the death penalty, is a government-sanctioned penalty that governments can impose upon people who commit serious crimes, like murder, and allows the government to order the execution of the offender. Executions and various forms of the death penalty have their histories rooted in the earliest human civilizations. The first officially established death penalty laws originated from the Code of Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, and other accounts extend as far back as the 5th century BCE's Roman Law of the 12 Tablets. In Canada, capital punishment dates back to when Canada was still considered a colony under French, then British, rule. Capital punishment sentences continued in Canada even after it attained independence in 1867. Before 1976, capital punishment was ordered for people who committed crimes such as murder, treason, and rape. Offenders continued to be sentenced to capital punishment up until July 26, 1976, when the sentences of the death penalty for murder were eliminated. In practice, the death penalty ended in two stages. The first stage occurred in 1976 when Bill C-84 was enacted, abolishing the death penalty for offenders who committed murder, treason, and rape. The second stage occurred in 1998 when legislation was proposed to end the death penalty for people who committed military offenses, with that legislation passing on September 1, 1999. In place of the death penalty, sentences for life imprisonment were used instead. This brings us back to the question under debate. Should Canada bring back the death penalty? This matter is very important today. Violent crimes like murder still exist, with hundreds of murders taking place within Canada each year. According to Statistics Canada, over 780 murders occurred in 2024 alone. Additionally, many people believe that there should be stronger punishments for offenders who commit serious crimes. This brings me to my group's argument on this topic. We believe that Canada should bring back the death penalty for the most serious crimes. We believe that bringing back the death penalty will bring justice to victims of violent crimes and their families. Extreme crimes and the punishments used can raise many ethical questions. Many people question how severe punishment should be when it comes to violent crimes. Some believe that extreme crimes should come with extreme consequences. Many others believe differently. This raises questions about whether punishments for crimes should have limits. Some victims and their families believe that imprisonment is not strong enough punishment for offenders who commit serious crimes. Stronger punishments like the death penalty would offer the families of victims of serious crimes a greater sense of closure and that justice has been administered. The death penalty will also bring about an increased feeling of public safety, as violent offenders will no longer be released back into society, where they can commit another violent crime after their sentence is over. Capital punishment would permanently take violent offenders off the streets, ensuring public safety. From the perspective of Patrick Devlin's theory, it also shows that society takes certain crimes like murder so seriously that they believe the law may impose the harshest of punishments, and offenders forfeit their own lives for their moral irresponsibility and defiance of the law. As suggested by a 2025 research study, public opinion of the government will improve if capital punishment is introduced, with 54% of Canadians responding affirmatively to its return. As suggested by Emile Durkheim's theory of NME, severe punishments like the death penalty show that the government is serious about punishing those who have committed offenses, maintaining societal cohesion, and reinforcing collective moral boundaries. If the death penalty is brought back, there will be concerns about wrongful convictions, systemic bias, and the lack of clear deterrence effects. Our arguments will address these concerns, outlining strict conditions and high standards of evidence under which a person may be sentenced to capital punishment, and requiring evidence that can withstand scrutiny. There will be safeguards to protect citizens from being wrongfully convicted, and there will be an appeals process for those who believe that they are wrongfully convicted.
Now we will discuss part 1 of the history of the death penalty in Canada. In Canada, the death penalty has been used since the colonial era under Canadian law. This is due to the fact that Canada at the time was being governed by a European legal system, most prominently British and French law. In 1763, when Canada became under British rule, the country started to follow the laws of the British criminal justice system. During this period in the colonial era, capital punishment was an established commonality that was universally accepted. Authority figures slash elites of this time had a shared belief that the death penalty was essential in maintaining stability within society and felt it could help grow their colonies. This level of punishment was not only meant to convict those who committed heinous crimes, but the state also looked at it as a way to frighten and warn others to not commit certain offenses. Foucault, who we'll dive into a little bit later, had a theory that reflects this notion. He believed that the reason we see this level of punishment early on being displayed is due to the states wanting to show their power, and as a result, this would cause fear to citizens who do or even contemplate committing crimes. Obviously, specific crimes today are handled differently, as is their punishment. But in the early days of Canada, there were more crimes, not including murder, that were punishable by execution. Certain crimes like rape, treason, theft, arson, and violent crimes would all result in one receiving the death penalty. These laws that were inherited by Britain existed from the 18th century to the mid 19th century. In Canada, the primary method of execution was hanging. There was a period of time where executions would be public, where citizens would be allowed to watch the executions commence. These viewings would also be meant to incite fear in the public, showing the state's power and authority. As said earlier, these ideas connect to Foucault. He theorized that these public executions' primary goal was to not only pass the sentence, but to show where the true power lied, and that was with the government and its laws. For Foucault, power is not as simple as it is for Marx. He argues that power is not possessed by a single authority, but operates through networks of institutions, practices, and knowledge systems. It is productive and is always coercive. We see how coercive power can play a role in influencing the public by threats and punishment, and that is exactly what Canada did in that time period. Using this power to try and influence society to not commit any serious offense, otherwise, a public execution will be your fate. Foucault, in his book, when discussing the importance of public punishments in earlier societies, states that the ceremony of punishment then is an exercise of terror. When the jurists of the 18th century began their polemic with the reformers, they offered a restrictive, monimist interpretation of the physical cruelty of the penalties imposed by the law. If severe penalties are required, it is because their example must be deeply inscribed in the hearts of men, but a policy of terror, to make everyone aware through the body of the criminal of the unrestrained presence of the sovereign. The public execution did not re-establish justice, it reactivated power. In the 17th century, and even in the early 18th century, it was not. Therefore, with all its theater of terror, a lingering hangover from an earlier age, its ruthlessness, its spectacle, its physical violence, its unbalanced play of forces, its meticulous ceremonial, its entire apparatus were inscribed in the political functioning of the penal system. This enables us to understand some of the characteristics of the liturgy of the torture and execution. Above all, the importance of a ritual that was to deploy its pomp in public. Foucault is essentially describing punishment and execution were public performances, and criminals' body were symbolic messages to the public to show them what would happen to them, and that authority during this time had a level of control and power over life and death if they defied the authority or committed heinous offenses. Eventually, as time had gone on, Canada had decided to move away from public executions and have them take place inside prisons. This act had started the shift of a regulated and institutional justice system. The movement of executions from public spaces into prisons reflects what Foucault describes as a shift from sovereign power to disciplinary power. Rather than displaying authority through public violence, the state began to exercise control in more hidden and institutional ways, relying on prisons and surveillance instead of spectacle. Around the late 1800s and early 1900s, a sense of change began to emerge regarding the opinion of the death penalty. Discussions started to happen on the regards of human rights as well as wrongful convictions. There were even those who started to consider rehabilitation rather than punishment. Because of the improvements of the legal system and rigorous evidence being required, some were worried about individuals being wrongfully executed. From then on, people started to question and debate if the death penalty was truly needed. Around the 1950s and 60s, that is when the debate started to truly gain traction and become strong. There were Canadians that believed that there was no place for the death penalty anymore in a modern construct justice system. People started to feel like imprisonment was a better route to take than the death penalty. These ideas that were taking place during this period again reflect on Foucault, who felt that societies were starting to stray away from the death penalty and physical punishment/torture and moving towards a system which includes prisons and incarceration for an extended period of time, along with surveillance becoming more prominent and reliable for a government as a way to control offenders. In 1976, criminology professor Dr. Azat Fatah, in his book on the death penalty in Canada, started talking about how public opinion on the subject was starting to sway as years had gone by, and their true thoughts on whether capital punishment should continue or should be abolished entirely. In 1943 and again in 1953, more than 7 in 10 Canadian adults felt that the death penalty for murder should be retained in the criminal code, while only 2 in 10 were against it. Movements for the abolition of capital punishment were either too weak to have an impact on public opinion, or were, as was the case in many provinces, non-existent. With increasing political stability and economic prosperity, a steady erosion in public support of the death penalty took place. Following the publication of the Royal Commission on Capital Punishment in Great Britain in 1953 and the report on the Canadian Joint Committee of the Senate and House of Commons on Capital Punishment in 1956, a dramatic change in public opinion could be easily noticed in the results of the Gallup poll of 1958. The poll showed that the death penalty had lost the support of a sizable segment of the Canadian public. From 71% in favor of capital punishment in 1953, the ratio had dropped to 52% in 1958. 33% wanted to abolish executions, while a larger number than usual were confused and undecided. These debates on capital punishment sparked historical change for the death penalty in Canada, as the final executions of 2 men who were convicted of murder were carried out in 1962.
Hi there, my name is Lori, and today I'll be talking about why the death penalty can provide justice for victims as well as their families. So, I want to start by asking you something. I want you to imagine somebody that you love. Think about a loved one, somebody that you love, whether it's a parent, a sibling, a close friend, your partner, and what if they were taken from you in a brutal and deliberate murder? And just like that, their future disappears. Every birthday, every family dinner, every memory you would have made together is now gone. And now I want you to imagine the person who did the crime. And what if they continued living on for decades while the person that you loved never got a second chance at life? for a lot of people, that's why the debate around the death penalty still exists. And it's not just about punishment, it is also about justice for the victims and the people that they leave behind. So as we've said before, in Canada today, the death penalty no longer exists. It was abolished in 1976. So even after almost 50 years, the debate around it still never completely disappeared. Many Canadians still believe that removing the death penalty was also removing an important form of justice for the most extreme crimes. So supporters of the death penalty are not always talking about revenge. Most of the time they're talking about fairness and also accountability. Their argument is that when a crime is extremely serious, the punishment should also reflect that. One idea behind this is called retributive justice. Right over here. So in simple terms, it means punishment should fit the crime. And when it comes to crime, murder is generally considered one of the most serious one possible. When someone is murdered, that loss can never be undone. The victim loses their entire future, and then their family loses them forever as well. Because the harm is permanent, supporters of the death penalty argue that the punishment should also be serious as the crime. So Canadian law already treats murder as a serious offense. So someone who is convicted of first-degree murder automatically receives life in prison and cannot apply for parole for the next 25 years. That alone shows how we treat our criminals in Canada. But supporters of the death penalty argue that in some cases that punishment doesn't even feel like it fully reflects the harm that was done. So one example that we can use would be Robert Pickton or Paul Bernardo, where these men kidnapped and also sexually assaulted and murdered women. Those cases shocked our entire country. They're still to this day remembered as as some of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. And supporters of the death penalty often point out to those cases or cases like this and ask a difficult question, which is, if crimes this cruel and that there are also planned out crimes, mind you, don't deserve the strongest punishment possible, then what crimes would deserve the strongest punishment possible? Another important reason, people still support the death penalty today is the impact that murder has on families. So when someone is murdered, the pain does not just stop with the victims. The family often carries that loss for the rest of their lives. Parents lose children, children lose parents, siblings lose brothers and sisters, and just people lose their loved ones. For many families, life imprisonment doesn't feel like it's justice. The offender keeps on living while behind bars, obviously, but while the victim is now gone forever. Supporters of the death penalty argue that the justice system should recognize the value of the life that was taken and the lasting pain experienced by the family as well. Another thing that people often tend to forget is that the legal process doesn't always just end after trial. Many families have to return to court years later for parole hearings or appeal, and every single time that they have to go back to court, they may be forced to hear the details of the crimes over and over again, or even see the person responsible for their loved one's death, which is quite traumatizing. And for families, this can reopen wounds that never fully healed and that they are actively trying to heal, which makes it longer for them to heal, obviously, and adding on to their trauma as well. Supporters of the death penalty argue that families deserve some more sense of closure. They shouldn't have to relive and re-experience the worst moments of their lives again and again decades later. Another argument would be that it involves cases where another argument supporters often make involves cases where multiple victims were involved. I really struggle with that, sorry guys. When one person murders several people, obviously the damage spreads much further. Now, in this case, it would be multiple families would lose loved ones, and then in the long run, that affects entire communities and are affected for a longer period of time as well. And a good example for that would be the mosques in Quebec. where there was a shooting where 6 people were killed while they were praying. And by Alexandre Bissonnette, and that created such a shock in Quebec for a really, really long time, and that happened in Quebec City. So for a really long time in Quebec City, the Muslim community was also scared to even go pray and practice a religion and everything like that. It affected the community for a really long time. Another case would be Bruce McArthur, who murdered 8 men in Toronto as well. That deeply affected the community in Toronto for quite some time, and I would say still to this day is quite affected by it as well. Crimes like these leave such deep scars on communities. Supporters of the death penalty argue that when someone destroys so many lives, the punishment should also reflect the same scale of that harm. Another issue that comes up involves crimes against children. So crimes that involve sexual abuse or the murder of children are amongst the most disturbing crimes in society. Supporters of the death penalty argue that the individuals who commit these crimes often show patterns of predatory behavior that are extremely difficult to rehabilitate. People that are recognized as sexual offenders, predators, pedophiles, and things like that are part of the top hardest and least rehabilitated people. They tend to reoffend multiple times over and over again. So when crimes involve kidnapping, sexual violence, and murder of younger victims, supporters believe that the offender has shown a level of cruelty and danger that society cannot ignore anymore. Another important part of this debate is the message that punishment sends. The justice system does more than punish just criminals. It also reflects what society believes is acceptable and unacceptable. A lot of our actions done by the legal court system is sometimes reflective of public's opinions and things like that. So supporters of the death penalty argue that the harshest crimes should receive the harshest punishment possible because it clearly shows that society will not tolerate these actions. And that we don't stand by those. Some supporters also believe that the death penalty may help prevent certain crimes. The idea is obviously deterrence. The argument is that the consequences are severe enough so some people might think twice before committing the worst crimes. Even if the death penalty only prevented a small number of murders, supporters argue that saving a few innocent lives would still matter. Public opinion is also another important part of this discussion. So polls in Canada have shown that Canadians still actually support bringing back the death penalty for the more serious crimes. A poll that was done by Research Co. In 2025 found that about 54% of Canadians actually support reinstating the death penalty for murder, and a similar poll was done also the year before, so in 2024, and found support was even higher with about 57%. So these numbers show that even after decades it was abolished, a significant amount of Canadians still believe that the justice system should have the option to have the ultimate punishment for the worst crimes. So finally, there's also a moral argument that supporters often make. Some people believe that when someone intentionally takes innocent life, especially in a cruel or repeated way, they could give up their moral right to remain part of society. So for example, as people like Robert Pickton and things like that, they have given up their right to be part of a society as they have repeated the offense more than once. To like different girls and everything like that. Like they had time to think about their action. It wasn't just like a oopsie little accident. The idea is simple. Some actions are serious, and that person responsible deserves the strongest punishment possible. In the end, supporters of the death penalty believe their argument comes down to justice. So murder permanently destroys a life. Families suffer in lasting pain. Some crimes are so extreme that life imprisonment doesn't seem proportionate to the harm caused. And for supporters the death penalty, the question becomes very simple. When someone deliberately destroys innocent lives in the most brutal way possible, should the justice system respond with the strongest possible punishment available? And the answer should be yes for them.
We will now examine the modern Canadian history of the death penalty, beginning with the final executions. On December 11th, 1962, two men were executed by hanging at the Don Jail in Toronto, Ontario, marking the last executions carried out in Canada. Their names were Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin. Lucas had been convicted of shooting and killing an undercover FBI informant during a robbery at a Toronto bar in 1961. Turpin, on the other hand, had murdered a police officer during an armed robbery of a furniture store earlier that same year. Although executions stopped after 1962, the death penalty itself remained legal in Canada for more than a decade. During the 1960s and early 1970s, Canadians continued to question whether the government should have the power to take a life as punishment. There were major concerns for human rights, fairness in the justice system, and the possibility of a wrongful conviction. All of these began to shape public debate. Discussions eventually led to the major policy shift in 1976, when Canada abolished the death penalty for murder. To understand why this happened, it is important to examine the social changes, political debates, and evolving ideas about punishment that were taking place in Canada at the time.
The vote in the House of Commons was extremely close, 130 to 124. That narrow result shows just how divided both Parliament and the country still were on this issue. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's government supported abolition and argued that the state should not have this power. When the bill passed, capital punishment for murder was replaced with a mandatory life imprisonment, and first-degree murder carried a life sentence with no eligibility for parole. All that remained was a new system called the Faint Hope Clause, which allowed some people convicted of murder to apply for reduction in their parole ineligibility after serving 15 years, but only if a jury agreed. In 1987, the Canadian government held a parliamentary vote on whether capital punishment should be reinstated. After a significant debate, members of parliament voted against bringing the death penalty back, allowing for the abolition policy to remain in place. Later, in 1998, capital punishment was fully removed from Canadian law, when it was abolished for military offenses under the National Defence Act. This history matters for our argument because it explains why the abolition occurred, but it also highlights something equally important, that the decision was always contested. The 1976 vote was narrow, and in 1987 it returned to Parliament. One thing that we know is that public opinion has never fully settled. So while the history explains why Canada abolished capital punishment, it also shows that the question has never fully disappeared. That opens the door to asking whether the reasoning behind the abolition should still be accepted without challenge today. One of the most important points is that the abolition did not end public support for the death penalty. In 2012, polling found that roughly 63% of Canadians still supported reinstating the death penalty in certain circumstances. More recent polling shows that it declined, but did not disappear. National polls found that 51% of Canadians still supported the death penalty in 2022. That number rose to 54% in 2023 and 57% in 2024. So the issue remains politically alive in public opinion, even though it's no longer part of any mainstream federal party platforms. Support for the death penalty also varies differently across regions of Canada, supported across various provinces. Some regions strongly support reinstating the death penalty, while others strongly opposed it. This demonstrates the cultural barriers and value differences based on region alone, making the federal government consult with premiers equally. The highest levels of support were found in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where about 75% of people supported its return, especially in cases of murder and other horrific crimes. Quebec, unsurprisingly, showed the lowest support with only 36% of respondents in favor of reinstating capital punishment. This matters greatly because being part of the same country does not mean every province shares the same values or political outlook. Provinces have different histories, cultures, and views on justice. In Quebec, for example, people are generally more likely to emphasize human rights, rehabilitation, and limits on state power. In Saskatchewan, people are often more open to tougher punishments and may see harsher punishments as more appropriate responses to violent crimes. So even though federal law applies across Canada, the public does not respond to it in the same way everywhere. Some provinces are more concerned with protecting rights and avoiding state overreach, while others place more importance on punishment, deterrence, and justice for victims. That difference helps explain why one national policy can still be debated so differently across the country. Despite mixed public opinion, Canada's political leadership has largely remained to keep the abolition in place. But that does not mean the issue is closed. Laws can be changed, and criminal justice policy has changed many times before when governments decided that older approaches no longer matched current public concerns. If support for reinstatement remains strong in parts of the country, especially after serious violent crimes, then political resistance alone is not enough to prove that policy should never be revisited. History reminds us that Canada's decision to abolish the death penalty was not permanent or unquestioned. It was a response to a specific moment shaped by the values and fears of that time. But policy has to answer to present day realities, as well as past concerns. If many Canadians no longer believe that life imprisonment is enough for the most serious crimes, then the reasons that once justified abolition may no longer be strong enough on their own. That is why history matters here. It shows that policy changed before and why it can still be challenged today. Foucault does not give us a simple argument for or against the death penalty. Frankly, he doesn't care. That is where people often misuse him. His point is not to tell us what policies to support. His point is to show how punishment changes when the way power works in society changes. In Discipline and Punishment, Foucault explains that older systems of punishment relied on visible violence. Public executions were meant to show the power of the sovereign. The body condemned person became the place to which the state displayed its authority. Punishment was dramatic, public, and physical. Modern punishment works differently. Instead of making power visible through execution, the modern state exercises power through its institutions, like prisons, courts, police, and bureaucracies. That is the key shift. Canada did not simply become more humane when it abolished the death penalty and moved from one form of punishment to another. In his work, Foucault shows that power and knowledge shape how societies think about crime and punishment, which means ideas about whether the death penalty is right or wrong are never completely neutral or unbiased, and why the debate will continue. The truth is subjective. In the end, whether Foucault supports the abolition or not doesn't matter, because his theory is not about taking sides. It is about exposing how power works. His importance to this debate shows that abolition did not end punishment, that it simply changed its form. His value here is not analytical. It's not personal. He helps us understand the shift in power, not give a final opinion on the policy itself. Violent crime has not disappeared from society. Canadians all over the country face risk of violent attacks daily, and far too often does justice fail. Murders, mass attacks, and killings of police officers still occur. In 2024, police reported 788 homicides in this country. And when these crimes happen, many people question whether the current punishments truly reflect the seriousness of this act. Canada's history of the death penalty should not be treated like a closed chapter. A policy made for the fears and values of the 1970s does not automatically answer the demands of the present. If the justice system is still facing the worst forms of violence, then the real question is whether Canada is defending a principle or simply defending an old decision because that has become politically comfortable. That is why history matters, not because it ends the debate, but because it exposes how open the debate still is. Public opinion in Canada continues to show that nearly half of Canadians still support the death penalty, and in some provinces, closer to 75%. This demonstrates at least that the issue of capital punishment is not simply a historical debate. Instead, it remains a policy development for the modern world.
This section concerns itself with the morality aspect of the death penalty. So when society is confronted with actions of severe crime, such as intentional murder, questions arise about justice and moral responsibility, which are central to the discussion of punishment. We understand criminal justice systems as not limited to just maintaining public safety, but also focusing on ensuring that those individuals who commit serious crimes are held accountable for their actions. Moral responsibility plays a major role in determining a punishment suited to the offender. The justice system carries a responsibility in administering fair punishment equivalent to the crime. This means severe crimes warrant severe punishment. The justice system has a purpose evidently in its name, which is to deliver justice, meaning those affected by the crime must be acknowledged during sentencing, and retribution should also be a focus. Immanuel Kant's view of punishment in society uses this exact retributive lens, understanding that punishment should be proportionate to the crime committed. Kant believes that when a criminal is punished with death for committing murder, that their punishment reflects a moral balance between the crime and punishment, as he argues that precisely the symmetry between his crime and punishment that morality as distinguished from state's manly prudence requires. So what Kant means in this passage is that punishment should focus on morality and fairness. When Kant mentions as distinguished from state's manly prudence, he is indicating that punishment should not prioritize factors that are useful or practical to the government, such as deterrence and convenience, or costs and public policy, but more so a reflection of the weight of the crime. This highlights the importance of providing emotional closure to those affected by the crime, while also reaffirming the importance of the harm done. From Kant's perspective, he's suggesting that punishment is rooted in a moral obligation in addressing the wrongdoings of offenders and restoring balance. Kant understands that serious crimes receiving the harshest punishment, like the death penalty, is a society that perceives the loss of life as something significant and sacred. Thus, the death penalty understands the severity of human life without administering harsh punishment to crimes that are deserving of such penalization. We desensitize ourselves to the loss of human life, and that can become detrimental as it undermines the principle or individuals being held accountable for the crime and the harms that they knowingly inflicted. This then shifts to the conscious decision of intentional murder. These actions represent complete responsibility, and individuals committing this crime are fully aware that their actions deliberately destroy innocent lives, disrupting the peace of not only those individuals that they killed, but also the larger community as a whole. For instance, Paul Bernardo was involved in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of two young schoolgirls in the early 1990s. His actions perpetrated by him involved extreme violence and sexual assault on his victims. Bernardo's actions resulted in the harm of many women while also bringing pain upon their families and friends, and he essentially destabilized the peace in the communities he terrorized. This case highlights the severity of criminal acts and brings the question whether a sentence of life imprisonment is truly sufficient in reflecting the severity of such acts. This also raises the critical question that why should offenders like Paul Bernardo have the freedom to their liberty despite being responsible for the permanent loss of many others? This ethical dilemma concerns itself with attaining retribution for the victims. This is significant because doing so reinforces society's moral condemnation of grave criminal acts and upholds the shared value of human life. If society lacks a strong societal moral condemnation of extreme crime, this can disrupt shared moral values as it reflects a system of punishment that is tolerable to severe criminal acts, as society becomes less and less punitive on actions that consistently violate the moral consensus that has been established. So this can be better understood through the work of Emile Durkheim, specifically with his theory of organic solidarity, which rests upon the notion that societal unity and stability are reinforced by the social glue which keeps people together through shared cooperation and a shared sense of morality. Although Durkheim himself never supported the death penalty nor the administration of harsh punitive punishment, his theory of organic solidarity explains the importance of collective moral sentiments of society, which can be used to better understand the effect of death penalties in stabilizing and working as that exact social glue that keeps society together. More importantly, Durkheim's theory aligns with the importance of communal unity and stability. Punishment expresses the collective moral sentiments of society. Thus, it can be better understood that in the argument of capital punishment, when using Durkheim's concept of social glue and organic solidarity, we can understand that societal cohesion greatly outweighs criminal deviance. Thus, punishment should reflect moral condemnation. Durkheim states that this moral consensus allows for society to remain stable and free of enemy. When the justice system responds with the death penalty in cases of severe criminal acts, it reinforces the societal value for actions that violate the core values of society and ensures that the safety and moral order of community is kept while giving significance to the loss of human life. Thus, we can understand punishment not as something that should be lenient, nor taking the chance of risking more people's lives. Supporting this punitive measure not only ensures the stability of society is kept,
Hi there, my
as
name is Lori,
retribution
and today
and
I'll be talking
justice
about
is
why the death
delivered,
penalty can
and the
provide
victims
justice
and those
for
affected by
victims
the
as well
crime
as their
can be given
families.
closure,
So I want
but
to
also
start by
the fact
asking
that
you
on a moral
something. I
scale
want
it
you to
becomes
imagine
consistent with the
somebody that
level
you
of
love.
crime
As
committed,
we've said
because
before,
criminals will be dealt with
in Canada
swiftly,
today, the death
especially
penalty no
since
longer
intentional
exists. It was
acts of
abolished
crime
in
such as
1976.
intentional
So
murder
even
deserve
after
punishment
almost 50
and
years,
sends a
the debate
message that
around
no
it
such acts
still
will
never
be
completely
tolerated.
disappeared. Many
Therefore, our
Canadians
argument
still
in
believe that removing the
support
death
of the death
penalty
penalty positions that the
was
death penalty
also removing
mirrors
in like an
society's
important
moral
form of
opposition to
justice for the
extreme
most
violent
extreme
behavior,
crimes. So
as well as the
supporters of the
notion that
death
the
penalty are
deliberate
not
killing
always
of a
talking
human
about
being is
revenge.
the
Most
most
of the
serious
time they're talking about fairness and
offense
also
which must be
accountability.
matched with a
Their
serious
argument is
penalty,
that when a crime
restoring the
is extremely
importance of
serious,
human
the
life.
punishment should also reflect that.
Hello
One idea
everyone. In
behind
this
this is called
presentation, I will
retributive
examine
justice.
the public safety argument used to support the death penalty and connected to a philosophical debate between Lord Devlin and H.L.A. Hart. So, the public safety argument suggests that capital punishment may be justified because it protects society from individuals who have committed the most serious acts of violence. So, supporters of this argument believe that the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens from extreme harm. Because of this responsibility, they argue that severe punishments may be sometimes be justified when dealing with individuals who pose serious threats to society. However, the issue is not only about punishment, it is also connected to a broader debate about the relationship between law, morality, and the limits of state power. So, by examining the ideas of Devlin and Hart, we can better understand how supporters attempt to justify the death penalty and why critics challenge those justifications. So, the public safety argument begins with the idea that one of the most important responsibilities of the state is to protect the safety and security of its citizens. So, when individuals commit extremely violent crimes such as murder, they demonstrate that they may pose a serious threat to society. Because of these, supporters of the death penalty argue that society has the right to defend itself from individuals who commit these kind of acts. So, from this perspective, the death penalty is often presented as a way to permanently remove extremely dangerous offenders from society, ensuring that they will not be able to harm others again. So, this argument becomes particularly interesting in countries like Canada because the death penalty was abolished in 1976, and individuals convicted of first degree murder already received life imprisonment with long periods of parole ineligibility. Because of this, an important question emerged. So, if life imprisonment already removes dangerous offenders from society, does the death penalty provide any additional protection? So, to understand how supporters respond to this question, it is useful to look at the philosophical arguments developed by Lord Devlin. Lord Devlin developed an important theory about the relationship between law, morality, and social stability. Devlin argued that societies are held together by shared moral values. So, according to him, these values or these shared values function as a type of social glue that allows societies to remain stable and organized. So, he believed that if these shared morals values begin to weaken, society itself could begin to break down. Because of this, Devlin argued that society has the right to defend its moral foundations through the use of law. So, in other words, Devlin rejected the idea that law and morality should be always be completely separate. Instead, he argued that criminal law may sometimes be used to protect the moral values that help maintain social order. So, for Devlin, when individuals violate fundamental moral values or rules, they are not only harming specific victims, but they're also threatening the shared moral framework that allows society to function. Though Devlin did not directly argue for the death penalty, supporters of capital punishment often apply his theory to debates about punishment. From this perspective, certain crimes represent extremely serious violations of society's moral rules. Crimes such as murder violate one of the most fundamental moral principles within society, which is the prohibition against taking another person's life. Supporters therefore argue that when individuals commit crimes that severely violate these moral foundations, society might be justified in imposing that the most severe punishments available. So, in this way, Devlin's theory is sometimes used to support harsh punishments by arguing that the state has the responsibility to defend the moral order that allows society to remain stable. However, this argument raises an important question. So, should punishment be used primarily to defend society's moral values, or should it focus only on preventing harm? So, this question becomes clearer when we examine the idea of permanent removal. Another important part of the public safety argument is the concept of permanent removal. Supporters of the death penalty argue that individuals who commit extremely violent crimes may continue to pose risk even after they're imprisoned. So, while life imprisonment removes offenders from the general public, it does not completely eliminate all risks. So, violence can all still occur within correctional institutions. Individuals serving long sentences might still pose dangers to other inmates or to correctional officers. So, because of this, some supporters argue that the death penalty provides the most definitive form of protection by permanently removing the offender. So, the state ensures that the individual will never be able to harm others again. From this perspective, the death penalty is presented as the strongest possible measure for protecting society from individuals who have committed the most serious acts of violence. However, critics argue that life imprisonment already removes offenders from society and might therefore achieve public safety without requiring capital punishment. So one of the strongest criticism of this argument comes from the legal philosopher H.L.A. Hart. And Hart argued that the purpose of law should be primarily to prevent harm rather than to enforce moral values. So this idea is closely connected to what is known as the harm principle, which suggests that the law should intervene mainly when actions cause harm to others. So Hart criticizes Devlin's view by arguing that societies do not necessarily collapse when moral values change. Because of this, he believes that the state should be cautious about using criminal law simply to defend morality. From Hart's perspective, punishment should focus on preventing harm while also limiting the power of the state. This criticism raised an important concern. So, if the state begins to punish people primarily to defend morality, it may risk expanding its power in ways that threaten individual freedom. The supporters of the death penalty often respond to these criticisms by emphasizing that capital punishment is intended to be used only in the most serious cases. In many jurisdictions, the death penalty is limited to extremely severe crimes such as first degree murder with aggravating factors. These aggravating factors may include multiple murders, murders committed during other serious crimes such as kidnapping or rape, or acts of terrorism resulting in death. So, because the death penalty is irreversible, courts require very strong evidence before it can be imposed. So, the death penalty cases often involve lengthy trials, multiple levels of appeals, and extensive judicial review. So, supporters argue that these strict procedures are necessary in order to minimize the risk of wrongful convictions and to ensure that the death penalty is applied only in the most extreme situations. So, by limiting the death penalty to most serious crimes and requiring a strong evidence, supporters believe the legal system can attempt to balance public safety with concerns about fairness and justice. In conclusion, the public safety argument for the death penalty is based on the belief that the state has a fundamental responsibility to protect members of society from individuals who commit the most serious acts of violence. Supporters of this argument often connect it to Lord Devlin's view that societies are held together by shared moral values. From this perspective, extreme crimes such as murder do not only harm individual victims but also violate the moral foundations that help maintain social order. Although critics such as HLA Hart argue that the law should only focus primarily on preventing harm and limiting power of the state, supporters respond that certain crimes represent such a severe threat to society that stronger measures may be justified. In situations where individuals commit the most extreme acts of violence and demonstrate that they pose permanent threats to others, the state might be justified in imposing the most severe punishments available. From this perspective, the death penalty is understood not only as a punishment for the most serious crimes, but also as a way for society to defend itself and reform the moral boundaries that protect human life. For supporters of the capital punishment, this means that when crimes represent extreme violations of both public safety and society's moral order, the death penalty might be justified as a final measurement to protect society and uphold justice.